They called her incompetent, unqualified, dangerous, even, in whispered conversations by the medication dispensary where she couldn't hear but absolutely could. Dr. Mercer had been working this angle for 3 months now, methodically poisoning the staff against the quiet night nurse who kept her eyes down and her mouth shut. He didn't know she was there to watch him. He didn't know the patient in room 312 was the reason her entire life had been remade into this fragile fiction of scrubs and stethoscope. Katie Morrison checked the full line on her way into St. Michael's Hospital at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, her badge hanging from a lanyard beside her trembling hands that looked soft and uncertain, hands that belonged to someone who'd never held anything heavier than a blood pressure cuff. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical dirge overhead, that particular hospital sound that never quite stopped, a rhythm that had become the metronome of her manufactured life. She moved through the empty corridors with the careful gait of someone apologizing for taking up space, her dark hair pulled back so tightly it looked like it might hurt, her white coat immaculate, her posture rounded forward in a posture of perpetual deference. Nobody looked twice at the nurse moving past the elevators. That was exactly how she needed it. The grand rounds had ended an hour ago, but Dr. Mercer's voice still echoed from the conference room where he'd spent 30 minutes using a patient chart, her chart, Katie's chart, as a teaching example. "This is what happens when we lower our standards," he'd said to the residents gathered around him, all of them young enough to believe that credentials mattered more than results, that the school name on a diploma was the same thing as competence. Katie had stood at the back of the room checking vitals on a portable monitor, her eyes fixed on the steady blue numbers, refusing to let her face react. Mercer had gestured at her chart with 2 fingers, as if the paper itself might contaminate him. State nursing program. Community college prerequisites. And somehow she's working nights in a level 1 trauma center. He'd smiled then, that particular smile that made the residents uncomfortable in a way they couldn't quite name. Her son's commanding officer is in room 312, she'd wanted to say. He's alive because I've spent 17 years learning how to keep people alive. But she hadn't said anything. The trembling came later, in the supply closet, alone with the boxes of saline and the sound of her own breathing, her fist pressed against her sternum where the anger lived like a second heart. Now, at the nursing station on the ICU floor, Katie pulled up the patient roster on the computer, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the unhurried precision of someone who had all the time in the world. Room 312. ICU Isolation Protocol. Postoperative recovery from acute thoracic trauma. The official record called it a fall. The official record was beautiful in its simplicity and useful in its complete disconnection from the truth. General Richard Hayes lay in that room with 3 bullet wounds that had somehow transformed themselves into complications from a fall, and Katie was the one monitoring his recovery while maintaining operational cover as a nurse who'd never seen combat, never held a weapon, never spent 5 hours extracting 2 wounded Marines and a general from a collapsed building in Ramadi while her own abdomen bled through her gear. The intelligence briefing had come through her secure phone 7 days ago, a text message that looked like a reminder to refill her prescription but contained exactly 17 letters of coded information. General Richard Hayes. St. Michael's Hospital, Norfolk. Room 312. Medical cover established. Monitor for security breaches. Assess threat level. Report any suspicious personnel or communications. The message was gone 15 seconds after she'd read it. The mission had existed for 5 years in the hollow places of her life, the spaces between her heartbeats, the seconds before sleep when her mind ran through faces she'd promised herself not to remember. Hayes had carried her onto the medevac helicopter in Ramadi, his hands under her shoulders, his voice steady in her ear, "Stay with me, Morrison. Stay with me." She had. And he'd held the flag at her son's funeral 14 months later, when her boy came home in a box instead of in the Black Hawk that should have carried him. Katie had watched Mercer stand, his tailored suit perfectly pressed, his expression performing sympathy like an actor who'd rehearsed for exactly this moment. Hayes had been there too, in dress blues, his jaw clenched, and she'd seen him fold that flag with hands that knew how to break things, how to mend them, how to honor them. She hadn't seen him again until 7 days ago when the Pentagon had positioned her at St. Michael's with a new nursing license, a new social security number, and a new reason to keep her eyes down and her mouth shut. Katie made her way to room 312 now, moving through the corridors like water finding the lowest point, her presence so unmemorable that a resident passed her without seeing her at all. The room was dark except for the monitors casting their blue glow across the walls. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, a sound that should have been terrifying to someone who hadn't heard it before in desert hospitals and fobs and the back of flying coffins. General Richard Hayes was asleep, his left shoulder heavily bandaged under the thin hospital gown, his right side taped where the second wound had been closed, his abdomen wrapped in compression bandages that looked like they belonged to her mission briefing instead of a civilian hospital. The bullet hole in his left thigh had been the concern, the one closest to the femoral artery, the one that had nearly ended everything in a parking garage outside Naval Station Norfolk at 03 for 7 hours last Monday. Katie checked the monitors with movement so practiced they required no thought, blood pressure 118/72, heart rate 64 and steady, oxygen saturation 98% on 2 liters, core temperature 37.1 degrees Celsius. She made notes on the chart with handwriting that looked careful and uncertain, nothing like the precise mission report she'd filed for 5 years through encrypted channels. Her hand touched his wrist for a pulse check, unnecessary, the monitors showed everything, but she needed the contact, needed to feel the steady warmth of him alive. "Captain," Hayes said, his eyes still closed. It was barely a whisper, the first word he'd spoken to her since she'd arrived at St. Michael's, and it used her real rank. Katie's hand went very still. "Just the night nurse," she said, her voice the voice of someone apologizing for existing. She added 1 degree of chill to the 4-line flow and checked the medication drip, morphine, carefully calibrated to keep him comfortable without masking the alertness he'd need if the security situation deteriorated. "Your vitals are excellent, General." Mercer's been talking. It wasn't a question. Hayes's eyes opened now, and they were the color of Atlantic water in winter, and they looked at her with the weight of knowing exactly who she was. "His stage 1, Katie said quietly. Social attacks. Testing boundaries. Standard institutional bullying based on credential prejudice." She pulled her hand back, moving to adjust the 4 stand, her body language shifting back to that careful apologetic posture. "Nothing that threatens the mission." Hayes closed his eyes again. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm, that blue glow painting the room in colors that belonged more to dreams than to reality. "How long?" he asked. "Since I've seen you." Katie pulled up his chart on the tablet, checking labs that were all within normal range. 5 years, 17 days. "Your son?" She didn't answer. The question wasn't about information. The question was about the flag in her locker, the one she'd folded exactly as he'd folded his, with hands that knew how to make meaning. "Out of fabric and remembrance." "Stable," she said instead. "Rest now. I'll monitor vitals every 2 hours." She moved toward the door, her hand on the frame, that particular posture of someone who was sorry for taking up space in the world. Behind her, General Richard Hayes was silent. But the heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm, 64 beats per minute, the rhythm of a man who'd been given 5 more hours of life and who was already calculating what he could do with it. Katie stepped back into the corridor, where the fluorescent lights hummed their endless song and Dr. Mercer was approaching from the nursing station with that particular expression on his face, the look of a man who'd just finished a phone call that had given him permission to be vicious. "Morrison," he said, his voice like a knife being unsheathed. "We need to talk about your documentation." The corridor suddenly felt very small. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Katie Morrison, the quiet nurse with trembling hands, was already calculating exactly how long it would take to move from stage 1 of his escalation to the inevitable moment when his cruelty would force her to show him what she'd been trained to do. And she had absolutely no idea that the countdown had already begun. Grand rounds at St. Michael's happened every Tuesday at 0800, and Dr. Mercer orchestrated them like a conductor leading an orchestra toward a predetermined crescendo of humiliation. 12 residents filed into the conference room, their white coats still crisp from morning ironing, their notebooks ready for the kind of clinical pearls that would appear on board exams. Katie stood against the back wall in her scrubs, holding the patient chart for General Hayes, waiting to hand it forward when requested. She'd learned early that visibility during grand rounds meant vulnerability, so she made herself small, shoulders slightly rounded, eyes cast down, the universal posture of someone trying not to be noticed. "Gentlemen, ladies," Mercer began, his voice carrying the gravitas of someone accustomed to being listened to. He wore a navy suit under his white coat, cufflinks that caught the overhead lights, a wedding band that cost more than Katie's annual salary. "This patient presents an interesting case study in what happens when we lower our institutional standards." He turned to the wall-mounted chart, pointing with a manicured finger. "Admitted 5 days ago with traumatic thoracic injuries, 3 separate wounds, complications from a prior surgical intervention. Our night nursing staff recommended a medication adjustment based on outdated guidelines." He turned to face the residents, his expression one of theatrical concern. "This is what happens when we lower our standards, ladies and gentlemen. Our friend Katie here ordered a protocol that contradicted the 2019 guideline update. But then again, what can we expect from Norfolk Community College's finest?" The laughter came like a ripple through still water. 3 residents chimed in on cue, the ones Katie had watched eating lunch with Mercer in the physician's lounge, the ones calculating their career trajectories. One resident, a woman with dark eyes and genuine competence, didn't laugh. She looked at Katie with something like apology. But apology didn't change the mathematics of the moment. Katie absorbed it the way she'd been trained to absorb incoming fire, with controlled breathing and mental recalibration. She felt the tear forming before she could stop it, hot and unwelcome, and she let it fall exactly once, a single drop of salt that traced her left cheekbone while her jaw remained unclenched. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with the chart in her hands, not with Mercer's face, and spoke with a kind of quiet that made people lean forward to hear. "The 2019 guideline doesn't apply to patients with prior thoracic trauma, Dr. General Hayes has extensive scar tissue that contradicts the new protocol. The medication adjustment was clinically indicated, not outdated." The room went still in that way that happens when someone breaks an unspoken hierarchy. Mercer's face cycled through colors, surprise to indignation to rage compressed into 3 seconds. He waved his hand dismissively, a gesture designed to minimize her words, her competence, her existence. "Thank you, Katie. We'll continue without the editorial commentary." He turned back to the residents as if she'd already evaporated. But the damage was done. She'd corrected him in front of 12 witnesses. She'd made him look incompletely informed in his own domain. She'd violated the rule that kept the hospital's social order intact: nurses did not contradict doctors. Ever. The retaliation began the next morning. By Wednesday, Nurse Chen, the only person on the night shift who'd worked with Katie long enough to recognize that her competence was genuine and not academic, was reassigned to pediatrics. The note in the staffing system cited staffing needs and equitable rotation, the language of bureaucracy deployed to disguise a message: your loyalty has become expensive. Katie received an email at 1,430 hours restricting her ICU access to supervised entries only, requiring her to request permission for every visit to room 312, creating a paper trail that documented each moment she spent near General Hayes. She could see the strategy clearly, not crude enough to trigger HR investigation, subtle enough to isolate her from the patient she'd been positioned to protect, making her monitoring mission functionally impossible while maintaining plausible deniability. By Thursday, the whisper campaign had metastasized. Katie overheard 2 nurses in the break room discussing whether her credentials were legitimate. "I heard she falsified her degree," one said, the statement delivered with the casual authority of someone repeating gossip they'd already accepted as fact. "Someone said she's sleeping with administration for protection, that's why she hasn't been fired yet." The words landed in Katie's chest like shrapnel, not because she feared they'd be believed by people who mattered, but because she recognized the tactical genius of Mercer's move. By attacking her credibility, he'd created a scenario where anyone who defended her could be implicated in corruption. Doubt was the weapon. Doubt needed no evidence. The vending machine was on the 3rd floor, tucked into an alcove near the stairwell where the fluorescent light hummed with the sound of failing capacitors. Thursday at 15:45, Katie took her break there, 15 minutes of quiet before the night shift started at 1900. She was reaching for a ginger ale when she heard the footsteps, multiple people, coordinated, the kind of approach that signaled intent. Dr. Mercer appeared first, flanked by Dr. Ross and Dr. Patel, 3 attending physicians moving through the hospital with the casual confidence of men who'd never been told no. Behind them, a resident named Morrison, no relation to Katie, watched with the expression of someone witnessing something they'd regret not stopping. "Katie, sweetheart," Mercer said, his voice loud enough to carry down the hallway, loud enough to ensure that anyone passing would hear him. "I've been thinking about your comment this morning. Your clinical opinion." He smiled in a way that exposed too many teeth. "Maybe you be better suited opening your legs than opening charts. At least then your incompetence would serve a purpose." Dr. Ross laughed on cue, a harsh bark that echoed off tile. Dr. Patel joined in, his laughter slightly delayed, the laugh of someone following a script he'd received 30 seconds prior. "That way when someone sued us for your mistakes, at least we'd understand what you were really offering the hospital." Katie's breath caught. Not from shame required that she internalize his framing as truth, but from the physiological response to a predator revealing itself. She felt the tear before she could stop it, a second one, her body betraying her in the way bodies sometimes do when they're processing massive aggression. She wiped it deliberately with the back of her hand, a movement that was controlled and precise, and then she met Mercer's eyes with a steadiness that seemed to confuse him. In that moment, something shifted in her face, the submissive posture evaporating like water on a hot skillet. Her jaw unclenched. Her voice dropped an octave, carrying tonal weight it hadn't carried since her discharge papers from Camp Leshan. "General Hayes in room 312 is dying because you're too arrogant to admit you misread his CT scan," she said. Each word was separate, distinct, the kind of delivery that belongs to interrogation rooms and courtrooms, not hospital hallways. "There's fluid building around his heart that you diagnosed as normal post-surgical inflammation. His pericardial sac is expanding. In 72 hours, his circulation will fail, and you'll have killed him because your medical school pedigree costs more than your competence is worth." The hallway went silent. Not the quiet of a room with no sound, but the specific silence that happens when the air pressure changes, when everyone present becomes aware they've witnessed something irreversible. Dr. Patel's laughter died first. Dr. Ross took a step backward. And Mercer's face cycled through the recognition that something fundamental had just shifted, that the submissive nurse had spoken with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in circumstances that demanded obedience, that the metrics by which he'd been evaluating her were catastrophically incomplete. "Security," Mercer said into his phone, his voice suddenly smaller than it had been 5 seconds prior. "I need a security escort to remove a disruptive staff member from the ICU area. The nurse is becoming delusional, making accusations about my clinical judgment. For everyone's safety." But the resident named Morrison was already moving toward Katie, not to restrain her, but to position himself between her and Mercer, his body language shifting from passive observer to someone who'd just recognized what side of history he wanted to be on. And Katie, still holding her ginger ale in one hand, was already walking toward the stairwell with the kind of movement that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment since the first time Mercer had spoken her name with contempt. She didn't run. She didn't apologize. She simply moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd spent 12 years learning how to fight people far more dangerous than a man in a suit. The storm wall arrived at 1,400 hours like an advancing battalion. Katie stood at the ICU window, watching it move across Norfolk Bay with the methodical momentum of something that couldn't be stopped. 40-mile-per-hour winds. Surge projections at 6 feet. The kind of system that knocked out power grids and scattered backup protocols like ash. Her eyes tracked the darkness rolling inland, and her marine training, the part that never really left, recognized what was coming. A hospital without electricity was a hospital with a ticking clock. General Richard Hayes slept in the corner room, his chest wrapped in bandages from the assassination attempt that never made official news. Bullet fragments still nested near his left lung. The doctors called it a miracle he'd survived. Katie understood it differently. Miracles were what happened when your body's survival instinct overrode the damage. Miracles had a 3 to 5 day window before infection or hemorrhage recalculated the odds. The ICU staff moved in that particular rhythm of people bracing for crisis. The emergency generator had been tested last month. Backup systems were in place. Everything was protocol and procedure and absolute faith that the machines would keep running when the power died. Katie had seen different. She'd held soldiers' bodies when generators failed in field hospitals in Ramadi, when the surgical lights went black and there was nothing but headlamps and the sound of someone bleeding out in the dark. Lightning fractured the sky. The fluorescent panels overhead shivered. Every monitor in the ICU emitted a high-pitched distress tone, that collective electronic shriek of systems detecting power fluctuation. Katie's hand was already moving before her mind finished processing the sound. Reflex. Training. The part of her that wasn't a nurse at all. The backup generator engaged with a shudder. The lights flickered but held. Most of the monitors steadied. A false alarm. Crisis averted. 3 nurses exhaled. The ICU supervisor, a woman named Chen who'd been hostile to Katie since Mercer poisoned the staff against her, nodded once and returned to her charting. But General Hayes' monitor told a different story. His O2 saturation began its descent, 96, 94, 92. The trend line moving wrong. Katie moved toward his room without deciding to move, her body already knowing before her conscious mind caught up. The general's eyes were still closed, but his breathing had changed, shallow, rapid, the pattern of someone whose lungs were filling with fluid they shouldn't contain. She pressed her hand against his chest. Felt the tremor beneath the bandage. The blood loss had restarted. Internal hemorrhage. The pressure from his own blood was collapsing his left lung the way a stone collapses a paper building. At this trajectory, cardiac arrest in 4 minutes. Maybe 5 if his young body fought hard enough. Katie's jaw clenched once. Then released. She stepped into the hallway. Dr. Mercer to the ICU. General Hayes is decompensating. Her voice came out level, measured, the careful diction of a nurse reporting to her supervisor. No edge. No urgency that might betray what she already knew. Mercer appeared from the break room in under 30 seconds, moving with the confident stride of a man who'd never experienced consequences. He reviewed Hayes' monitor strip, frowned at the O2 numbers, and ordered a chest X-ray. Standard protocol. By-the-book response to a patient whose body was actively failing. Katie watched him make the decision that would kill the general, wait for imaging. Gather more data before acting. The hesitation of someone who'd never learned that speed and decisive action were sometimes the only medications that mattered. The X-ray tech arrived. The portable unit moved into the room. And Hayes' O2 saturation continued its descent like a stone finding water, 88, 85, 82. Get him on the monitor, Mercer said, his voice tightening slightly now, the first crack in his composure as the numbers told him something was genuinely wrong. Katie was already ahead of him, moving to the crash cart stationed outside Hayes' room, the emergency supplies every ICU kept within 20 seconds of any bed. Her hands found the emergency equipment drawer. She pulled it open. Scanned the contents. No thoracotomy kit. No surgical instruments beyond basic suture removal. The crash cart was designed for cardiac arrest, not for the kind of emergency that required opening a human chest to save it. Hayes' oxygen saturation read 79 now. His heart rate was climbing, the panicked rhythm of a body drowning from the inside. Mercer was on the phone with surgery, requesting an emergency operating room. It would take 18 minutes to get Hayes transported, prepped, draped, anesthetized. He had for minutes before cardiac arrest. The math was absolute. The situation was clear in the way that situations become clear when you've already died once and lived to catalogue the experience. Katie looked at the crash cart. At the surgical supplies. At the number 10 scalpel designed for small incisions on intact skin. Not for the thoracic cavity. Not for this. Not remotely adequate. She picked it up anyway. What are you doing? Mercer's voice was sharp now, the dangerous sharpness of someone realizing he was losing control of the room. Katie didn't answer. She moved into Hayes' room. Her hand steadied his body, positioning him on his back with an efficiency that made Mercer's breath catch. She located the fourth intercostal space by feel, between the ribs, just above the nipple line, and marked it with her fingernail. Gentle. Precise. The kind of mark someone would only make if they'd done this before. Step back, she said quietly. Not a request. Not the voice of a nurse asking permission. You cannot, that's not your scope. Mercer's voice had shifted into something higher, more frantic. He understood now that he was watching something impossible. That the woman he'd spent months systematically destroying, the woman he'd called incompetent in front of residents and laughable in front of his peers, was about to perform emergency surgery with a number 10 scalpel and confidence that came from somewhere far deeper than any hospital credential ever could. Katie made the incision. For centimeters through skin and subcutaneous tissue. The blood welled immediately, dark and arterial, flowing faster than it should have been. She worked through the external intercostal muscle, then the internal. The pop of the parietal pleura giving way. Exactly as she remembered. Exactly as those hands had learned to do in a Marine Corps field hospital while incoming rounds punched through the wall beside her. Hayes gasped. His body convulsed with pain that was worse than bleeding, worse than dying slowly. The kind of pain that comes from having your chest opened while you're conscious and present for every second of it. Katie's fingers located the pericardial sac. She incised it carefully. Precisely. And the pressure released in a rush, 200 milliliters of blood that had been slowly suffocating his heart poured out onto the sterile field she'd created in those 30 seconds. Hayes' breathing deepened. His shoulders sagged. The compressed lung could expand now. She packed the opening with gauze from the crash cart, applying pressure directly to the bleeding source with her palm flat against his chest. His heartbeat pounded against her hand, rapid, but steady. Returning to something resembling functional rhythm instead of the frantic skip and stumble of cardiac distress. 68, she said quietly, counting the pulse beneath her fingers. 72. Stabilizing. Mercer stood frozen in the doorway. His face had gone the color of unsweetened cocoa. His mouth moved but nothing emerged except a sound like wind whistling through a throat that had forgotten how to form words. General Hayes' eyes opened. For a moment, just a moment, they found her face. His hand reached up and grasped her wrist. The grip of a dying man who'd just been pulled back from the edge by hands he recognized on some cellular level that had nothing to do with knowing her name. Katie held pressure. 5 minutes. 10. The bleeding slowed. Plateaued. Stopped. Through the open doorway, Mercer had disappeared into the hallway. Katie heard his voice before she heard his footsteps, thin, frantic, almost hyperventilating as he spoke into his phone. Yes, this is Dr. Mercer at St. Michael's. I need to report a nurse performing procedures beyond her scope. Criminal scope. Her name is Katie Morrison. I'm documenting everything. She performed an unauthorized thoracotomy with a suturing knife. In the ICU. Without orders. Without authorization. Her credentials need to be investigated immediately. No, I have no idea how she even knew how to do this. I need the licensing board. I need them here today. Katie's jaw tightened. Just once. A small gesture that would have been invisible to anyone watching from more than a few feet away. Her cover was burning. 5 years of deep intelligence work, the careful construction of an identity as a quiet, humble night nurse, the patient observation of hospital staff for evidence of the leak that had almost killed General Hayes, the systematic documentation of who had access to patient information and which staff members had shown unusual interest in high-security visitors. All of it was evaporating in the time it took for Mercer to make one phone call. She was supposed to be invisible. Supposed to be overlooked. Supposed to monitor Hayes from the shadows and report her findings back to the handlers who'd embedded her in St. Michael's under a fabricated nursing degree and a carefully constructed backstory. Instead, she'd just performed emergency field surgery that no civilian nurse should even know existed. She'd pulled a man back from death with hands that remembered Ramadi, that remembered the field hospital tent with the blood-stained walls, that remembered other generals and other soldiers and the particular way a human chest opens when you know exactly where the knife needs to go. Mission failure tasted like copper and antiseptic. It tasted like the scent of Hayes' blood drying on her palms. It tasted like the sound of Mercer's voice becoming a weapon that would dismantle everything she'd built in the time it took the licensing board to run a background check they couldn't fully complete without revealing classified information. And that was the moment Katie Morrison understood she'd just made a choice that couldn't be unmade. She'd chosen the general over the mission. The mission had never required her to save his life. The mission only required her to watch it end and report the facts to her handlers. She'd chosen something else instead. Something that didn't fit inside the operational parameters. Something that wasn't about intelligence gathering or protocol or maintaining cover. She'd chosen the man, not the mission. And now the world was about to know exactly what she was. The crash cart barely had anything. Katie yanked open the metal drawer and stared at the contents: gauze, bandages, syringes. No thoracotomy kit. No surgical instruments beyond the basics. General Hayes was drowning in his own blood. 3 minutes. Maybe less. She grabbed a number 15 scalpel from the sterile field tray. The handle was plastic, cheap, the kind used for minor lacerations. It would have to be enough. The power grid had failed when the hurricane hit hardest, backup generators not yet online, and Dr. Mercer stood frozen 3 feet away with his hands at his sides like a man watching a car accident he couldn't stop. Katie didn't ask permission. Permission was a luxury she'd surrendered 5 years ago when she pinned her cover story to her chest and became someone smaller than the warrior she actually was. She prepped the chest wall with antiseptic in 12 seconds. The smell of betadine cut through the salt air bleeding through the broken windows. Hayes' oxygen saturation was already dropping, 68, falling to 64. His blood pressure had collapsed to a pressure pump could barely maintain. Cardiac tamponade. The bullet had nicked something vital. His heart was drowning in its own fluid. BP 70 over nothing, Katie said to the 2 ER techs who'd wheeled him in. Her voice wasn't asking. It was commanding. Get me 1,000 milliliters of O negative on pressure. Now. And someone find me a Kelly clamp if this hospital has one. One tech ran. The other froze. Katie had already moved. The scalpel went in at the 4th intercostal space, left anterior lateral thoracotomy. The incision was perfect, 7 centimeters, deep enough to reach the pleural space. Her hands moved with the precision of muscle memory that belonged to a different life, a life that had included 3 tours through Ramadi's burning streets, a life where she'd opened chests in field tents with mortar fire walking the perimeter. Blood spilled immediately. Dark, venous blood mixed with the clear fluid of pericardial effusion. She could hear it, a wet, draining sound like a sink with the plug pulled. Hayes' oxygen sat dropped to 58. Retractors, Katie said. Someone found a Balfour. She positioned it and the chest wall spread open like a surgical map, and there it was, the heart, pale and struggling, wrapped in fluid that was killing him. The bullet had entered the pericardium, the sac surrounding the heart itself. She incised the pericardium with the same scalpel. The fluid drained. Vital signs on the monitor began climbing almost immediately. O2 sat, 62. Then 68. Then 74. His heart rate was still bradycardic, but it was firing. Regular. The bleeding vessel was visible now, not the lung, not the heart itself, but the right atrial appendage, and it was hemorrhaging into the pericardium like an open faucet. The Kelly clamp appeared in her hand. She didn't remember asking for it. Someone had heard the command in her voice and obeyed it. The clamp went on with mechanical precision. Bleed controlled. O2 sat, 78. Then 82. Pressure bandage, she said. Her voice had dropped an octave without her noticing. Someone paged Dr. Patel. Tell him we're moving to OR in 90 seconds. But there was no OR yet. The hospital was still running on emergency power, generators still spooling up, surgical suite still dark. Katie would have to hold this. 90 minutes minimum. Maybe longer. She pressed gauze and a pressure dressing against Hayes' open chest. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. She'd done this in a burning clinic in Ramadi with incoming fire, done it in a convoy ambush with a Marine's intestines in her lap, done it in a forward operating base with nothing but will and training keeping people alive. What she hadn't done was do it as a nurse. Not in 5 years. Dr. Patel arrived at the bedside exactly 30 seconds later. He was one of the 3 doctors who'd laughed in the vending machine. He stared at the field thoracotomy, at the open chest, the controlled bleeding, the precision of the work, and his face went white. "Who did this?" he whispered. Katie stepped back. She didn't answer. She let her hands speak instead. Hands that had held lives together. Hands that had carried a man 4 miles through Ramadi with her own blood mixing with his. Hands that had just exposed 5 years of deep cover in 5 desperate minutes. The pressure dressing held. Katie maintained it, her arms braced against the side of the gurney as they moved Hayes toward the surgical suite. The backup generators had started. Lights flickered back to life. But the work had already been done. The impossible work. The work that only someone with captain-level combat medical training could perform under that kind of pressure, in that kind of darkness, with that kind of certainty. 90 minutes. Katie held pressure the entire time. Her arms began to shake at 45 minutes, fatigue moving through her muscles like electricity, but her hands never wavered. Not once. She'd been trained to endure. Trained to maintain. Trained to sacrifice her own body to save the mission, save the unit, save the general who'd folded her son's casket flag with hands like hers. When Dr. Patel finally had the surgical suite ready, when the surgical team took over and Katie could release the pressure dressing, the general's vital signs were stable. Not strong. But stable. Alive. Because she'd broken every cover protocol, revealed every classified skill, and done what a Marine intelligence captain does when a mission requires sacrifice. She stepped back from the OR table. Blood covered her scrubs. Her arms ached. Her hands were shaking now, not from fear, not from doubt, but from the specific exhaustion of holding back death for 90 minutes with nothing but will and muscle memory and the ghost of her son's voice in her ears saying, "Don't let him die, Mom. Don't let the general die." By 08:20 hours, as Hurricane Celia passed and the hospital restored full power, Katie knew what was coming. She could see it in the way Dr. Mercer avoided the surgical corridor. She could see it in how he'd already started making phone calls, his face flushed and furious, the color of someone whose entire worldview had just been shattered by a woman he'd spent months dismissing as simple. The security guards arrived before the surgeons finished closing. "Ms. Morrison," the lead guard said. His name was Torres and his eyes wouldn't meet hers. "You need to collect your belongings. You're on administrative leave pending investigation." Katie nodded. Once. She didn't argue. She'd known this moment was coming since the scalpel first touched Hayes' chest. She walked to her locker and emptied it, the evidence bag containing the folded flag, the flag from her son's casket, the one she'd carried for 5 years as the only piece of him she'd allowed herself to keep close, a spare set of scrubs, a photograph of Michael in marine dress blues, age 19, before the war made him less boy and more symbol. The hospital laundry was on the ground floor. It smelled like industrial detergent and steam, like a place that cleaned things but couldn't make them new. Katie placed her scrubs in the return bin with the same precision she'd once used to fold her son's uniform when he was 10 years old and playing Marine in the backyard, before Ramadi made it real. Before the folded flag became the only thing she had left of him. Mrs. Chen, the laundry supervisor, watched silently. She didn't ask questions. She'd seen enough of life to know that some silences held more truth than any conversation could contain. Katie's hands rested on the fabric for 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked past Mercer's office. He was interviewing her replacement, a young nurse named Amanda who laughed at something he said. Katie's reflection in the glass showed a woman who'd failed at both her identities. Failed to save her son 5 years ago. Failed to maintain her cover now. She exited through the staff door at 09 for 7 hours. 5 hours after saving General Hayes' life. The parking lot was empty. The rain had stopped. The wind had calmed. Hurricane Celia was moving inland, leaving nothing but broken things and the smell of salt water mixed with ozone. Katie sat in her car for 7 minutes without starting the engine. She held the evidence bag containing the folded flag. She could feel the weight of it, heavier than any physical thing should be, heavy with 5 years of grief, heavy with duty, heavy with the sacrifice of watching a man you'd sworn to protect while pretending to be something less than human. Her phone would ring soon. The Pentagon would call. The mission was compromised, but her cover had held long enough. Hayes was alive. That was all that mattered. But sitting in the silence of her car, Katie let one tear escape. Just one. The kind that comes when you've given everything and nobody will ever know what you actually gave, because knowing would cost you the only thing you've built in 5 years, the ability to pretend that you were ever truly small. By dawn, the calls had already been made. Katie wasn't there to hear them, but she heard the aftermath. Nurse Rodriguez found her in the break room at 0600, eyes red from crying or exhaustion. Katie couldn't tell which, and Rodriguez wouldn't meet her gaze. They're pulling you from the ICU rotation. Effective immediately. Rodriguez's voice trembled. I'm sorry. I don't know why. I was just told. Katie nodded once. She already knew. The licensing board. The calls had gone out at 2,300 hours while she was still holding pressure on General Hayes' chest cavity, while Dr. Mercer stood frozen in the darkness, while the hospital's generator hummed its mechanical dirge through corridors that no longer had electricity but somehow still had institutional authority. He'd moved fast. Strategic. Not the bluster of a threatened ego, but the calculated strikes of a man who understood leverage and knew exactly which doors to knock on. By 0700, her ICU privileges were suspended pending investigation. By 0800, 3 of her allies had been reassigned to the day shift, different floors, different departments, scattered like cells after mitosis. By 0900, a security officer arrived at the nursing station with a cardboard box and an expression that suggested he'd been given very specific instructions about the words involuntary termination and immediate cessation of duties. The box was standard issue. Industrial. The kind used for fired employees and failed experiments. Katie looked at it the way you'd look at a photograph of your own grave. She emptied her locker in 6 minutes. The stethoscope. The badge. The small emergency kit she'd kept in the back corner behind 3 years of shifted supplies. Her scrubs came off in the locker room where the fluorescent lights buzzed their endless commercial song, that sound like insects trapped in glass, like the world's most expensive insomnia. She folded them carefully. Each movement precise. Military corners on a pair of scrubs that had concealed more than fabric could hold. The blue scrubs were folded again and again until they formed a perfect square. 4 inches by 4 inches. The size of a greeting card. The size of nothing at all. She walked to the hospital laundry at 0935, past staff members who suddenly found urgent business in other hallways. The laundry room smelled like industrial bleach and the particular exhaustion of machines that never sleep. Mrs. Chen, the laundry supervisor, looked up from her sorting station and her face shifted, not away from Katie, but toward something that resembled pity, which was somehow worse than contempt. Katie placed the folded scrubs on the counter. The blue rectangle sat there like evidence. I'm done, Katie said. Mrs. Chen didn't ask questions. She'd been at St. Michael's for 17 years. She'd seen careers collapse before. She'd learned not to speak during collapses. She simply nodded and placed the scrubs into the institutional bin where they would be washed and distributed to new nurses, new identities, new people who might not carry the weight of 5 years of impossible silence. Katie walked to her car in the parking lot. The Norfolk morning was humid and grey. The kind of humidity that pressed against your skin like hands, like interrogation, like 5 years of pretending to be smaller than the bones you'd been built with. She sat in the driver's seat for 14 minutes without starting the engine. Her hands rested on the steering wheel. Steady. Not trembling. The trembling wasn't fear. The trembling would have been relief, and she couldn't afford relief. Relief was surrender. At 1,100 hours, she returned to her apartment in a converted Victorian on Stockley Gardens. 4 rooms. 1 bedroom. A kitchen she'd never used for anything more complex than coffee. The folded flag from her son's funeral rested in its place on the bookshelf, still in its government-issue triangle, still pressed at the angles that military protocol demands. 5 years she'd kept it here while she worked as a nurse, while she moved through St. Michael's and corridors in borrowed identity, while she protected a general who carried memories of burying her boy. She picked up the flag now. It was heavier than it should have been. Not physically. Physically it weighed maybe 8 ounces, the weight of government ceremony and polyester and lies told in the shape of folding. But it carried the density of 5 years compressed into one physical object. The density of mission failure. The density of covers blown and operational security shattered in 5 minutes of emergency medicine. She held it against her chest and sat on the edge of her bed and did not allow herself to cry because Captain Catherine Morrison had stopped crying sometime in her second tour in Ramadi, in 2009, in a room that smelled like diesel and copper and the particular scent of medical supplies burning in an open fire. At 1,430 hours, her phone rang. Unknown number. She let it ring. It rang again at 14:32. And again at 14:45. By 1500, she'd received 17 calls and 43 text messages from numbers she'd never stored and emails to addresses she'd thought were deactivated. The intelligence community moves fast when a cover collapses. Someone at the Department of Defense had recognized what happened in that emergency room. Someone had understood that Katie Morrison had just blown 5 years of deep cover intelligence work to save the life of a Marine general. The calls would continue. The directives would come. The extraction protocol would activate, and someone in a Pentagon office would mark her file as compromised and her placement at St. Michael's as terminated. This was how it ended. Not with violence. Not with confrontation. With a cardboard box and paperwork and the understanding that some identities you wear can only be discarded once. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Mercer didn't have to wait for protocol or Pentagon intervention or the slow machinery of official accountability. He had his own kind of power, the kind that moved through hospital politics like a knife through water. At 1,645 hours, Katie passed St. Michael's on her drive home. She didn't intend to drive past it. Her apartment was in the opposite direction. But her hands took the turn onto Colley Avenue and her foot didn't protest and she found herself in the parking lot where she'd sat in her car that morning, and she found herself walking back through the main entrance where security no longer tried to stop her because she'd become invisible again, which was what happened when you were fired, when you no longer belonged to the institution, when you became a ghost with credentials that didn't exist. The ICU corridor was exactly as she'd left it 6 hours earlier. The machines. The monitors. The particular smell of antibacterial soap and hope. She could hear General Hayes' monitor from room 312, that steady mechanical heartbeat that meant the thoracotomy had held, that meant she'd saved him, that meant she'd destroyed everything to do it. She walked past his room without stopping. She walked past the nursing station where Nurse Rodriguez wasn't visible. Rodriguez had been reassigned to pediatrics, Katie remembered, her presence erased from the ICU as thoroughly as Katie's own had been. And she walked past Dr. Mercer's office. The door was open. The blinds were half drawn. And Dr. Mercer sat at his desk across from a woman in navy business casual, someone's resume spread out on the mahogany surface between them. His replacement. Already being interviewed. Already being selected. Already preparing to take Katie's position, her hours, her patience, her identity in this place. It took Dr. Mercer maybe 3 seconds to notice Katie standing in the doorway, and his face shifted, not into guilt or shame, but into something that resembled satisfaction. A smile that said, "This is how power works. This is what happens when you step out of line." Katie didn't acknowledge him. She didn't need to. She turned and walked back down the corridor and out through the emergency room doors where the afternoon Norfolk heat pressed against her like an interrogator's hands. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know if her 5-year assignment was finished or merely interrupted. She didn't know if there would be debriefs, meetings in anonymous offices, conversations with handlers who would explain that the mission was a success despite the cover being blown, despite the identity being scattered like cells after mitosis. What she knew was that Dr. Mercer believed he'd won. What she knew was that he'd made his calls to the licensing board, had orchestrated her removal, had placed her in the cardboard box marked terminated. What she knew was that he was already interviewing her replacement, already moving on to the next person he could diminish, the next nurse he could reduce to a body that existed only to serve his authority. But the Pentagon has a longer memory than any hospital administrator. The Pentagon has resources that exceed the authority of a single chief of surgery, no matter how many calls he made, no matter how many allies he'd cultivated through years of careful politics and condescension and the particular cruelty of a man who'd built his entire career on the assumption that pedigree mattered more than competence. 6 months would pass. 6 months of Katie waiting in her apartment, receiving calls, understanding that something was moving in the background, federal machinery, intelligence apparatus, the slow grinding of accountability that operates by its own timeline and according to its own rules. 6 months would pass before the Admiral arrived. 6 months before the investigation notice would be delivered to Dr. Mercer's office during morning rounds, before the hospital CEO would walk into his department with suspension papers, before the video would surface on social media, Nurse Rodriguez's phone footage from the vending machine, the audio crystal clear, Mercer's voice unmistakable, "You'd be better suited opening your legs than opening charts." The video would go viral in 4 hours. 2 million views. By midnight. By dawn, the hashtag would trend nationally. By the second day, news outlets would pick up the story, the bullying culture at St. Michael's, the buried complaints, the pattern of harassment stretching back a decade. And then Dr. Patricia Chen, Mercer's own medical school mentor, would release a statement disowning him publicly, recommending his license be suspended, suggesting that every patient case he'd supervised be reviewed for competence and ethical violations. The destruction would be complete and total and absolutely thorough. But Katie wouldn't be there to witness most of it. She would learn about it through emails, through news alerts, through the particular satisfaction of seeing a man's career collapse with the same precision he'd tried to collapse hers. She would watch from her apartment as Dr. Mercer's wife filed for divorce, as his country club membership was revoked, as St. Michael's terminated him for cause with no severance, no letter of recommendation, nothing but a file marked with every mistake he'd ever hidden behind his credentials. And then, 6 months later, Katie Morrison would return to St. Michael's wearing marine dress blues, captain's bars gleaming in the Norfolk sun, walking through the ICU where nurses snapped to attention and General Hayes stood waiting in room 312, and on her way to see him, she would pass the community college annex where Dr. Mercer now taught CPR basics for minimum wage, teaching chest compressions to people who couldn't afford better, his hands shaking, his future as small as he'd tried to make Katie's. She would look through that window and see him, and she would nod once, not in victory, not in triumph, but in the particular acknowledgement of two people who had collided in the space between identities, who had tested each other's limits, who had learned that true heroism is what you do when the world stops watching, and that sometimes, the world watches anyway. If you're still watching, hit that like button. And I want to know, would you have saved the man who fired you, or walked away? Drop your answer in the comments. Subscribe and let's see how this ends.